Our story begins with a broken family and a young boy caught in the crossfire. Alexander was born in 356 BC into a world of political violence and betrayal. His father, Philip II of Macedonia, was a brilliant but brutal king who transformed Macedonia from a backward mountain kingdom into a military powerhouse. But his greatest battles were fought in his own palace. Imagine being 7 years old and watching your parents tear each other apart. Philip had 7 wives, but his relationship with Alexander's mother, Olympias, was pure poison. She was beautiful, intelligent, and absolutely ruthless. The palace echoed with their screaming matches, accusations of adultery, and threats of murder. Olympias would whisper poison in young Alexander's ear. "Your father doubts you're his son. He thinks you're the son of Zeus himself." She practiced mysterious rituals, sleeping with snakes, claiming divine visions. Some nights, little Alexander would find her in trance-like states, speaking to the gods. At age 13, Philip hired Aristotle to tutor his son. For 3 years, the philosopher shaped the boy who would reshape the world. Aristotle gave him a copy of Homer's Iliad. Alexander slept with this book under his pillow for the rest of his life. He didn't just read about Achilles, he believed he was Achilles reborn, destined for glory and an early death. The first crack came when Alexander was 16. A Thracian tribe rebelled, thinking the kingdom was weak. They were wrong. Alexander didn't just crush the rebellion. He founded his first city, Alexandropolis. But when Philip returned, instead of praise, Alexander saw something that would haunt him forever. Fear in his father's eyes. That fear became reality at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. 18-year-old Alexander, commanding the cavalry, delivered the decisive blow that crushed the combined armies of Athens and Thebes. Greece fell that day. But watching from the battlefield, Philip realized something chilling. His son had just proven himself the superior general. The palace became a powder keg. Philip took a 7th wife, Cleopatra Eurydice. At the wedding feast, fueled by wine and resentment, Cleopatra's uncle declared that now Philip might finally have a legitimate heir, not half-barbarian like Alexander. Alexander exploded. He hurled his cup and screamed, "What am I then, you villain?" A bastard. Philip, drunk and enraged, drew his sword and lunged at his own son. But the great king stumbled and fell. Alexander's words cut deeper than any blade. "Look! Here's the man preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he can't even cross from one couch to another." That night, Alexander and Olympias fled Macedonia. The heir to the throne had become an exile, cast out by his own father. But fate had other plans, and they involved a dagger in the dark. In 336 BC, at his daughter's wedding, Philip II was assassinated. A guard named Pausanias stabbed him to death in the theater. The official story blamed a personal grudge, but whispers followed Olympias for the rest of her life. Had she orchestrated her husband's murder to put her son on the throne? Alexander, just 20 years old, found himself king of Macedonia. But he inherited enemies who saw his youth as weakness. Thebes rebelled first, thinking the boy king couldn't match his father's iron grip. They were catastrophically wrong. Alexander's response was swift and merciless. In just 2 weeks, he marched 300 miles south and surrounded Thebes. When they refused to surrender, he completely destroyed the city. 30,000 Thebans were sold into slavery. The message was clear. This was no ordinary 20-year-old. But Alexander's eyes were already looking eastward toward the Persian Empire, the greatest power on earth. His advisors begged him to wait, to consolidate power. Alexander's response reveals everything about his tortured psyche. "I cannot waste time on such matters when there are worlds to conquer." In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with 35,000 men. His first act on Asian soil was deeply personal. He visited Troy and laid a wreath on Achilles' tomb. Then he declared that Achilles was blessed to have Homer tell his story. But Alexander would write his own legend. The Persian Empire had ruled for 200 years, stretching from India to Egypt, encompassing 50 million people. Against this colossus stood a 22-year-old with daddy issues and an Iliad under his pillow. The first test came at the Granicus River. Persian forces lined up along the far bank, ready to slaughter the Macedonians as they crossed. But Alexander did something no sane commander would do. He personally led the cavalry charge across the river, straight into enemy spears. A Persian noble's sword shattered his helmet. Another aimed a killing blow at his head. Alexander's friend Cletus saved his life by cutting off the attacker's arm. Why would Alexander risk everything in personal combat? Because he understood that his men needed to see him share their danger. Every soldier who watched their king fight like a common warrior would follow him to the ends of the earth. Victory followed victory. At Issus in 333 BC, Alexander again charged personally into the Persian lines. Darius III, seeing the young Macedonian cutting through his guards like paper, panicked and fled, abandoning his family and treasure. After the battle, Alexander found Darius's wife, mother, and daughters cowering in a tent, expecting death. Instead, he knelt before the old queen mother and promised her family would be treated with royal honor. Why this mercy? Perhaps because Alexander, who'd grown up in a broken family, couldn't bear to break another. But Darius wasn't finished. He was assembling the largest army in human history for one final confrontation that would decide the fate of the world. At Gaugamela in 331 BC, everything would be decided. The night before the battle, Alexander couldn't sleep. He walked among his men, and they saw something in his eyes they'd never seen before. Doubt. For the first time, the odds seemed truly impossible. His general Parmenion suggested a night attack. Alexander's refusal reveals his tortured relationship with glory. I will not steal a victory. He needed to win in broad daylight, with the whole world watching, or the victory would be hollow. At dawn, facing a sea of enemy spears and the thunder of war elephants, Alexander made a decision that defied every rule of warfare. Instead of spreading his line to match the Persian front, he concentrated his forces and charged at an angle directly at Darius himself. It was insane. It was brilliant. And it worked. The Persian line bent, then broke. Darius fled again, and with him fled the heart of his empire. In one afternoon, the Persian Empire, which had seemed eternal, collapsed. But victory came with a price Alexander hadn't anticipated. As he chased Darius across the empire, his men began to change. They'd been simple Macedonian farmers. Now they were conquerors of the world, drunk on power and gold. At Bucephalus, the ceremonial capital of Persia, something inside Alexander's army broke. Despite his orders, they looted and burned the city. The palace that had stood for 200 years was reduced to ash in a single night. Alexander wept as he watched it burn, not from remorse, but from rage. Rage that his men had robbed him of the choice. He wanted to be seen as a liberator, not a destroyer. But that night, he realized he was riding a tiger that he could no longer control. And the tiger was hungry for more, but what Alexander would do next would reveal the darkness growing inside him. After Darius was murdered by his own nobles, Alexander became king of kings, ruler of the Persian Empire. But instead of returning home in triumph, he kept going. East, always east, toward the edge of the world. This is where we see Alexander's deepest psychological wound. He couldn't stop conquering because he couldn't face what lay beneath the conquest. A desperate need to prove himself worthy of love. Every victory was a letter to his dead father, a message that said, "See, I am worthy." But it was never enough. In Central Asia, he married Roxana, a Bactrian princess of legendary beauty. But this wasn't political. This was love, passionate and destructive. Roxana was as fierce as Alexander, as willing to kill for what she wanted. Their relationship was a mirror of his parents, brilliant, toxic, and ultimately tragic. The army kept marching, through Afghanistan, where they spent 2 years fighting in mountains that would later break the British Empire and the Soviet Union, through Pakistan, where Alexander faced war elephants and monsoons. His men were no longer the farmers who'd crossed the Hellespont. They were walking ghosts, following a king who seemed determined to march them off the edge of the world. At the Hydaspes River in India, Alexander fought King Porus and his war elephants in one of the most brutal battles of the ancient world. Alexander won, but his beloved horse Bucephalus, his companion since childhood, died from his wounds. Alexander wept like a child and founded a city in the horse's honor. But the real breaking point came at the Hydaspes River. For 8 years, the army had followed Alexander to the ends of the earth. Now, faced with reports of vast Indian armies and more war elephants than they could count, they finally said, "No more." For the first time in his life, Alexander's men refused to follow him. The scene that followed was heartbreaking. Alexander raged, pleaded, wept. He locked himself in his tent for 3 days, hoping his men would change their minds. They didn't. For Alexander, this wasn't just military insubordination. It was the ultimate abandonment. The journey back would transform the greatest conqueror in history into something much darker. The journey back was a slow-motion catastrophe. Alexander's rage at being denied India turned inward, manifesting as paranoia and cruelty. At a banquet in 328 BC, when his friend Clytus, the same man who'd saved his life at Granicus, criticized his adoption of Persian customs, Alexander grabbed a spear and killed him with his own hands. The horror of what he'd done sobered Alexander for days. He'd murdered his closest friend in a drunken rage. The boy who'd once shown mercy to Darius' family had become a tyrant who killed those he loved most. The return to Babylon in 323 BC should have been Alexander's greatest triumph. He was 32 years old, master of the largest empire in human history, planning new conquests in Arabia and the West. But those who saw him were shocked. He looked decades older, worn down by constant warfare, heavy drinking, and the weight of impossible expectations. On June 10th, 323 BC, after a night of heavy drinking, Alexander fell ill with a fever. For 10 days, he lay dying while his generals whispered about succession, and his empire began to fracture. The man who'd conquered the world couldn't conquer death. His last recorded words, when asked who should inherit his empire, were, "To the strongest." It was a final riddle from a king who'd spent his life creating impossible puzzles. But perhaps the real tragedy isn't how Alexander died, it's how he lived. Here was a man capable of incredible compassion, who treated defeated enemies with honor and dreamed of uniting East and West in a single civilization. But he was also driven by demons he could never escape, the need to prove himself worthy, the fear that he was never enough, the desperate hunger for immortal glory. Alexander achieved immortality, but not the kind he wanted. His empire collapsed within a generation, torn apart by the very generals who'd helped him build it. His son was murdered, his line ended. But his name echoes through history. From the moment he crossed into Asia to this very day, no conqueror has matched Alexander's achievement. In just 13 years, he changed the world forever, spreading Greek culture from Egypt to India, creating the foundation for everything we call Western civilization. The boy who slept with the Iliad under his pillow became the hero of his own epic, one that's still being told 2,300 years later. And maybe, just maybe, that's the immortality he was really searching for all along. Picture this. It's 331 BC. The dusty plains of Gaugamela stretch endlessly before you. On one side stands the largest army the ancient world has ever seen. Over 250,000 Persian warriors war elephants, and scythed chariots. Their king, Darius III, commands from a golden chariot, confident he'll crush the young upstart who dares challenge his empire. On the other side, a 25-year-old Macedonian with just 47,000 men, outnumbered 5-1. Logic says retreat, pride says negotiate, but Alexander the Great does neither. Instead, he does something so audacious, so impossibly brilliant, that it will echo through history for over 2,000 years. This young man will pull off what many consider the greatest military victory of all time and change the course of human civilization forever. But here's the mystery that will haunt historians. How does a 20-year-old inherit a small kingdom and in just 13 years conquer most of the known world? What drove him to push beyond every boundary, to weep because there were no more worlds to conquer? Today we're diving deep into the untold story of Alexander, not just the legend, but the man. His fears, his pain, his impossible dreams, and the tragic price he paid for greatness. But first, we need to understand the broken family that created a monster.